شرارتی انجام بگیره ما خیلی اطمینان نداریم.
Simmering threats between Iran and the US have reached closer to their boiling point over military escalation, with Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei saying his country would retaliate if it was bombed by the US. Tehran would be, quote, compelled to move towards producing an atom bomb in the event of an attack, one official said, sparking fears that the country might be on the brink of weaponizing its nuclear program. But the inflammatory remarks did not come out of the blue. President Donald Trump warned on Sunday that the US would bomb Iran and impose additional tariffs if it did not agree to a nuclear deal. Tensions have been brewing for the past several weeks as the American president hawkishly tries to strike an agreement after withdrawing unilaterally from the existing one during his first term in office. In 2018, Trump exited the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA, which was implemented under the preceding Obama administration. But now, things have changed. The geopolitical landscape today is drastically different than it was back then. Iran's proxies in the Middle East have been greatly weakened in the spillover of Israel's offensive in Gaza. The Iranian-allied Assad regime has fallen in Syria, and for the first time, the unimaginable has become a reality when Israel and Iran exchanged direct military fire last year. The message is clear. Anything could happen. So which will it be? Deal or war? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we look at the possible outcomes of the escalating threats between the US and Iran and what it would take to strike a nuclear agreement and avoid a wider conflict. Along with the series of threats, there have also been some more promising exchanges, even if they had been said in a somewhat menacing undertone. President Donald Trump has said he would prefer negotiation over military action after sending a letter to Iran's supreme leader weeks ago. The Iranians responded, saying they would be ready for indirect discussions, with Oman as a mediator. So, could these developments lead to some sort of productive negotiations?
I think that's very optimistic.
This is Sanam Vakil. She is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House.
We have a long history of negotiations between Iran, the United States, the broader international community. We haven't had a long history of very many successful negotiations. Obviously, the JCPOA was that successful negotiation, the Iran nuclear agreement, but that did take 10 years to negotiate. I'd like to be realistic about what's on the horizon. It is positive, of course, that the Iranians have responded. We can expect a number of negotiation tracks to proceed in the coming months. There is a European track of the French, Germans, and British moving forward. This track between the US and Iran could be a second distinct track. And of course, it's important to note that we saw the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians also meet in Beijing just recently.
Since his return to office, Trump has also brought back a policy of, quote, maximum pressure on Iran through increased sanctions. The US has also launched an unforgiving bombing campaign in recent weeks on the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, the last man standing of its proxies in the region. All of this stands in sharp contrast to the prospects of negotiation.
Looming threat of military escalation is still out there. Since October 7th, Israel has been taking a very proactive approach to Iran and the axis of resistance across the region, has set back Hamas and Hezbollah in a very serious way. We've also seen last year 2 direct strikes on Iran itself. And of course, Iran also launched direct strikes on Israel. This took their confrontation into an overt setting, which is unprecedented in the region. And in the context of this weakening of Iran and Iran's posture in the region, the Israeli government is trying to lobby the Trump administration to take advantage of what appears to be a historic opportunity against Iran, and not just set Iran back and its regional project back, but also Iran's nuclear program back. So if we're thinking about scenarios for 2025, a military escalation, an attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure is certainly out there.
Warfare or diplomacy, both are options at this point. But even without the past 17 months of conflict in the region, Iran's nuclear deal was about to come to a pivotal juncture.
2025 was always going to be a very critical year for Iran's nuclear program. Effectively, the nuclear agreement expires in October of this year. And without an effective agreement that oversees Iran's nuclear program, with the return of the Trump administration that has reimposed sanctions, this has propelled a number of actors from the E3 countries that I mentioned before, but also Washington itself, to try to arrive at a new negotiated solution rather than pursue a military option. And we have a very short timeline because by October 18th of this year, which is known as Termination Day, the ability to put sanctions on Iran, known as snapback sanctions, will expire. And the European countries, if they don't succeed in obtaining a better deal to restrain Iran's nuclear program, have made it clear that they intend to use snapback sanctions. And so that will bring back multilateral sanctions on the Islamic Republic.
When the US withdrew from the JCPOA and imposed sanctions, Iran went on to advance its nuclear program, effectively abandoning its uranium enrichment limits set by the agreement. This caused alarm by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, that Tehran was only a short step away from the levels needed to create nuclear weapons. Even though Iran insists that it's only developing its program for civilian purposes, it has now said that the previous conditions of the agreement are no longer valid because of the progress that it has made so far. So, if talks do eventually happen, what terms could be on the negotiating table?
President Trump might be a bit more distinct from the people around him in his administration, has made it clear that he's seeking a nuclear deal. He's not seeking a broader deal, but he wants a better deal than the JCPOA. The Islamic Republic is also not interested in discussing Iran's ballistic missile program or its sponsorship of Hezbollah and Hamas and the axis of resistance in the region. So they're interested also in a nuclear agreement, one that will obtain them very meaningful sanctions relief. So there's a synergy here. I think here what can be achievable is not the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program, because Iran very much sees its nuclear program as its right as a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in this context, when you hear policymakers talk about imposing zero enrichment on Iran, that's a non-starter for the Islamic Republic. But what can be achieved? Probably a lengthening of the timelines of a nuclear deal, perhaps a perpetual deal on Iran, which could be linked to perpetual sanctions relief. Iran can sign what is known as the additional protocol. That is a document signed by a number of countries globally that will give stronger commitments and additional protection and guarantees. And of course, Iran can reduce the enrichment capabilities and the centrifuges that it has inside the country.
So the US certainly has pressure cards to strong-arm Iran, but the question is whether Iran, in its seemingly weakened form, has the leverage needed to prevent a US or even an Israeli military strike.
Iran doesn't have a huge amount of conventional military leverage, but it's certainly using the threat of weaponization and its capabilities in order to extract concessions from the US and Europe and other players. And at the same time, it's also engaging across the region, and particularly there are Gulf states, to use those relationships to build stronger ties, of course, but at the same time to pressure its neighbors and threaten its neighbors very directly, saying explicitly that they will be in the line of fire if Iran is attacked.
Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is perceived to be more willing to soften ties with Western states than his predecessor. At the same time, Arab Gulf states, which do not want to see the conflict landing in their backyards, have said that finding common ground with Iran is more important than focusing on disagreements. Sanam says this presents an opportunity for the international community to incentivize Tehran to make compromises, although this would not come easy.
This is indeed an opportunity, seeing a weakened Iran, to extract concessions. Of course, The problem is that Iran doesn't want to explicitly discuss those concessions. But with Hezbollah being degraded, with Hamas the same, with Bashar al-Assad's regime having collapsed in Syria, there is certainly an opportunity to rewrite the way Iran engages with those actors across the region. But quite interestingly, and I think this is important to say, as a result of maximum pressure and as a result of the sanctioning of the Iranian economy, Iran is more integrated into the region economically. It has built sanctions busting network with the axis of resistance, but also with other states across the region. And it will be much harder to isolate Iran through maximum pressure. But, the problem is that Iran's regional strategy is resistance-based against the presence of Israel and the United States in the region. And to change Iranian behavior, that requires a broader and more difficult response from the United States. I think today, in addition to seeking sanctions relief, Iran, not publicly, would like some kind of a security guarantee from the United States that Israel will not strike the Islamic Republic.
The US's military activity in the region goes a step beyond bold words. On Wednesday, the US sent an additional aircraft carrier strike group to the Middle East. It continues its military offensive in Yemen and has promised to bomb Iran into submission. The big question is, just how serious is the US about striking Iran if a deal couldn't be reached? I discussed this with Francesco Schiavi, Middle East researcher and non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, Switzerland. What can you tell us about what we've been seeing with regards to the US's military strategy over the past few weeks? Does the US want military escalation or does it want negotiation?
Well, I think that the US is walking a fine line between, let's say, deterrence and escalation by striking Houthi targets in Yemen through the US Heinrich Human Carrier Strike Group and deploying another aircraft carrier like the Carl Vinson Group to the CENTCOM areas, let's say. Washington is trying to signal resolve, especially under Trump's leadership, which favors muscular responses. But these are also limited strikes because the US administration is avoiding ground operations and they are calibrated, they stay below to the threshold of war. So, in my opinion, the goal now is to restore deterrence, particularly after the Houthis resume attacks on shipping. But of course, it's not just about the Red Sea. This is a message to Iran too, of course. The message is, you control your proxies or we will hold you accountable. It's strategic pressure, not yellful confrontation so far.
Is there a scenario you envision where Iran agrees to a new version of the JCPOA that includes it making concessions with regards to its support to the Houthis? Do you imagine a world where Iran would say, you know what, we're not going to provide them with the intelligence, we're not going to provide them with the training anymore, we're not going to prop them up, but just give us a deal and don't reinstate sanctions?
I mean, that is possible, but in my opinion, it's really hard for this to become reality, just for the fact that Iranian proxies are not just weapons. They are, let's say, also negotiating assets. When it comes on groups like the Houthis or also the Islamic resistance in Iraq, for example, they allow Tehran to apply pressure without direct confrontation. So again, the threat of Houthi attacks on shipping or on Israel gives Iran leverage in talks. Of course, they will still part of the, let's say, bargaining chips that Iran will bring to the table, but it's far from reality just to assume that he will give up what Tehran has built over the last 40 years as the cornerstone of its deterrence strategy.
A US intelligence report last week said that Iran was not actually developing weapons and that this plan was not reauthorized since it was suspended in 2003. But now we're seeing that Iran is saying that it would resort to nuclear weapons if it's attacked. And there's a bunch of different steps before we reach that stage where Iran becomes a threat to the entire world and can press a button and launch nuclear weapons. What stage are we at right now?
Much of, let's say, Iranian response to Trump's threat by resorting to nuclear weapons is likely a rhetorical escalation, not a strategic shift. Iran knows that any actual nuclear move or, let's say, even weaponization would bring severe consequences. But again, hinting at the nuclear card, let's say, helps Tehran assert the deterrence at the time when it's under military and political pressure. We have to keep in mind that Iran is a threshold nuclear state. It already possesses nearly all the key components for a bomb, which means enriched fissile material, advanced centrifuges, technical expertise, production infrastructure, and even potentially also delivery systems. But of course, he hasn't taken the final step, let's say, toward weaponization. Tehran maintains that its nuclear program is civilian, but we know that its calculus is evolving and it has changed over the last months, especially after the October 26th Israeli attack against its key infrastructures in production infrastructures for ballistic missiles and other key location and air defense systems. So let's say that increasingly nuclear latency is seen as a way to deter Israeli preemption and at the same time offset Iran's conventional weaknesses. So when Tehran hints at crossing the line, it's raising the cost of escalation, warning that if it's pushed to do far, it has the other options on the table.
With the deal set to expire at the end of this year, do you think that there's an opportunity for Europe to rally its support for a new version of that deal to be struck? Or do you think that we're going to reach termination day and have Iran under sanctions again?
European countries, especially those part of the E3 that has so far been part of the JCPOA, are more than willing to support any kind of progress that could be made in attempt to discuss all the elements that could help to lowering the level of threats that could emanate from Iranian nuclear program. But again, I think that the real question here is if Trump wants European back to the table. We know that the US wants Iran to come back to the table, but on Washington's term. And we also seen that Washington so far has kept European partners usually away from any of the main points of its agenda, including the Iranian field. The short answer is, yeah, they will probably want to do that, but we have to see if Washington first is willing to include other European members at the table.
What about Israel? We know that Israel was very much opposed to the JCPOA, staunchly so, but maybe with Trump at the forefront of a potentially new deal, maybe Israel could back that. And with war being such a threat to everybody in the region, what do you think Israel's position/role is right now?
On the one hand, Israel is keen to avoid any kind of weaponization of a nuclear device by Iran. But at the same time, most of the Israeli strategy vis-a-vis a nuclear-capable Iran, it was just part of their agenda. Most of Tel Aviv's interests are to strongly curb Iranian presence on the region and also have the free hand to act in neighboring countries. So all these elements are clear, but sometimes they are in line with the US interests and sometimes they are not. Washington weighs Israeli intelligence and security concerns closely, especially on Iran's proxies and nuclear program. But of course, the US decisions are ultimately shaped by, let's say, broader strategic interests. Israel has strongly advocated for, let's say, for an US attack against Iranian key assets. But I think that Trump, even if he has strongly backed Benjamin Netanyahu's action in the region so far, it has been the first international leader visiting the White House. But at the same time, he hasn't given Israel a blank check. Washington wants to avoid getting dragged into a wider war, especially if that means, let's say, hitting Iran directly. So Israel's way, it's real, but it's not absolute, I think.
Are you optimistic about a renewed deal? Or are you worried that things could potentially really escalate?
It's a $1 billion question, of course. And the situation is extremely volatile and everything could change, sometimes at best, but usually at worst. We know that so far, in military terms, the US have clearly the upper hand. the United States have precision strikes, naval assets, and a global reach for outweigh Iran. So, for example, even the IGC commanders' huge retaliation against the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, it's only being targeted symbolically, let's say, in Iranian rhetoric. But leverage isn't just about firepower. Iran plays the long game. So it uses ambiguity, regional proxies, and calibrated escalation to let's say, shift cost onto its adversaries. The question is, who can better absorb risk and sustain pressure? That will decide who gets what.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. For more on Iran, the US, Israel, and the nuclear deal, visit thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Altaji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.